actually.
Well,
But,
we'll just give you various sound bites and you can chop it up and do whatever you want with it. Okay. This is a very dangerous time for human rights because the rise of the populists does pose an enormous threat. They've undercut some of our traditional supporters of human rights, like the United States, but they've also really encouraged strong men around the world to claim to speak for the majority and in the process to demonize minorities and to undermine their rights. So there's a serious threat out there. But what we've seen over the last year is that there's also serious resistance to this agenda of hate and intolerance. And that where that resistance has emerged strongly, we've been able to limit the damage done by the populists. And so for me, it's very important to engage, to continue to fight back against this populist surge, because we've seen that that kind of engagement and resistance can make a big difference and can salvage rights where they're at risk. I mean, Hillary won the popular vote by a couple million, but her votes were too concentrated. Well, the rise of the populists was very much a response to genuine grievances that people had. They felt left behind economically. They were complaining about economic inequality. Many people disliked the cultural shifts associated with migration. Some people feared terrorism. And what the authoritarian populists did is take these legitimate grievances and scapegoat vulnerable minorities, to say, it's the migrants who are at fault, it's the asylum seekers, it's the refugees. And that effort to sort of blame a vulnerable minority for the problems of a majority has epitomized the rise of the populists. If he rips something after or whatever. But so far in the economic realm, he's behaved. Trump, in many ways, has been a disaster for human rights. Domestically, he's broken all the taboos against racism, against misogyny, against xenophobia. In his foreign policy, he has this insatiable admiration for strongmen. And so he embraces people like Putin or Erdogan, Sisi or Duterte. And of course, this makes it much more difficult to stigmatize these authoritarian leaders when Trump says, these are great guys. So what's really needed is for other governments to step into the breach. The British are gone because they're preoccupied with Brexit. They've really stopped playing an active role promoting human rights. And that's why we need countries like France and Germany coming to the fore. Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't. And so, yes, of course this happened in the past, but in today's era, this kind of approach was unusual. We see Emmanuel Macron's electoral campaign as a real turning point in the fight against populism. Other European leaders had tried to cozy up to the far right to try to preempt them, but ended up legitimizing them. Macron did it very differently. He openly confronted the National Front. He openly reinforced democratic values, and he persuaded the French people to reject overwhelmingly the agenda of hatred and intolerance. Now that was a very admirable campaign. The challenge now is, will he govern according to those principles? And it's been a mixed bag. Our biggest concern domestically has been his taking of the state of emergency and basically transforming it into ordinary law without any showing that those kinds of sacrifices of basic rights were needed to effectively fight terrorism. I think we have to be very careful about how do you confront actual propaganda, how do you confront actual fake news, because it's very dangerous for governments to get into the censorship business. When governments start telling us what's true and what's fake news, that's a recipe for censorship. You can imagine how that's going to be abused. And it's much more important to find tools to meet fake news with real news, or to perhaps undermine some of the economic incentives that the purveyors of fake news use. But we should be very careful not to use the fake news phenomenon as an excuse for governments to get into the censorship business.
Really done, really done. Do you have a busy agenda?
So, the reason, because of what just happened in